What will this year's election mean for Britain? What do the parties have in mind for your children's education, for instance? How will their policies affect the value of your home? The pound in your pocket? Or the environment you live in? At The Times, Sunday Times and Times Radio, we know that what happens in Westminster has a real impact on your world. So whatever politicians say or do, we'll explain what that means for you.
Good evening, welcome to the Times and Sunday Times newsroom. We're live with From Westminster to Your World. My name is Stig Abel. I'm the breakfast presenter on Times Radio, which means this is already past my bedtime. I should be asleep, but I don't want to be asleep because this is such an exciting election. This is such an interesting election. And despite what you hear from some people, it's going to be one of the most significant elections possibly of the last century. There's so much to talk about. And I'm delighted to welcome all of these brilliant journalists from the Times and the Sunday Times. Let me just introduce you to them. Kieran Andrews here, Scottish political editor at the Times and Sunday Times. Jerry Scott, senior political correspondent at the Times. Maureen Khan, economics editor at the Times, and Larissa Brown, defence editor of the paper as well. So we've got a broad area of expertise, and we will go through what we think are some of the interesting areas of this election, but also we want your questions as well. We've had some already before this programme started, but you can actually join in as we go along. There's a Q&A box on your screen on the live stream, and if you're on YouTube and you have a question, you can let us know by the comments, and by the magic of technology, they will swim their way to this little miniature iPad for me. So welcome, guys, great to see you. I do think this is an interesting and important election. It's been a hell of a campaign. It's still going on. There's basically a week to go. Jerry, let's start with you, but I want views on anyone. What's the thing that's lingered in your mind? If we say election 2024, what's the first thing you think of, Jerry?
The gaffes, am I allowed to say that?
can
It's the
definitely say that,
gaffes.
yeah.
Look, this hasn't gone well for the Conservatives, has it? From like day one with the rain and the lack of the umbrella, to then going to the Titanic, to now this betting scandal that we're seeing kind of unfold. It is the gaffes. I think
You've missed D-Day.
And D-Day, of course, yes, and
This is
D-Day, of
the
course.
uber gaff.
Yes, and I think we thought this might be a bit of a boring election, right? The conclusion's pretty foregone, and I think we maybe thought it was going to be a bit dull, but it hasn't been. It's been quite entertaining, quite interesting. There have been real policy points to get into. So, yeah, I think it's going to be a very interesting outcome. You know, the question is, how big is that majority going to be?
Do you think it would have made any difference if it had been a perfect campaign? Because one of these questions is, if everything had flown right for Rishi, would we be talking differently, or was he always on a hiding to nothing?
So look, I think we would have been talking differently, but I don't think it would have made a difference to the outcome. And I think if you look at kind of where the Conservatives have been in the polls in the last couple of years, if you look at really the party's pretty tired, right? Like if you speak to MPs, even if you speak to ministers, they're tired. They've been in government 14 years. That's really hard to get over. And so no, I don't think the eventual outcome would have been any different, but we might have been speaking about, you know, a more successful Conservative campaign.
Yeah, we had Grant Shapps on our radio show a couple of weeks ago when he first mentioned the supermajority thing. He just looked knackered. And we're so used to him being this Tiggerish. They always sent him out in any crisis. Mm-hmm. And then his shoulders were slumped, and he went, "We're really playing to stop Labour getting a supermajority." And that phrase, which is an American phrase, doesn't really mean anything in British politics, has become part of the lexicon of this campaign. I mean, that's one of the things I think of, I suppose, when I think of the election. Miriam, what do you think of? What's the first thing that occurs to you?
So I think it's a boring election relative to all of the other elections happening in the world this year. So one of the big stories about the global economy is some of the world's biggest economies are having elections this year. We've already seen elections in India, elections in Mexico. The big one, of course, is the US presidential elections. And the UK will stand out for a couple of reasons. One is that it's probably across the world, and definitely in Europe, one of the most successful centre-left parties in the world is going to be the Labour Party. For example, we had a European election a couple of weeks ago, the first time the UK was not involved. It was all about the shift to the right and to the far right. If the UK had been a member of the European Union and we were still in, Labour's projected vote share would have switched the entire dynamic of the European Parliament towards the left. They're super successful compared to all of their, family parties. In Spain, we're in government, they're suffering. In Germany, the Social Democrats are suffering terribly. The centre left is being wiped out across most of the rich developed world. That's not true in pockets like Mexico, but I think that's considered to be a more radical left than where Labour would want to position.
And is that because we had our shift, we had our Brexit, we had our 2019 Tory majority, and some would say we've played out? I mean, no one's saying that majority was a far right one or anything like that, but we had our moment of right-wing insurrection in 2016 and 2019. And
potentially, I think the problem with Labour is that if we think about how lots of developed world economies have fallen into this populist drift, often the interregnum period is a boring centre-left government. The most obvious example being Hollande in France. Yeah. And if you now think of the longue durée of what's happening in France, that ultimately maybe led us to where we are today. Yeah. And the main example is 2 Obama terms in the US, which is a centrist, progressive leaning government, which ultimately perhaps the seeds for whatever lay next, and Trump came before. That's a problem. There are other issues in the UK mitigated by our political system, binary choices, elections, first past the post, which maybe means we will never fall into that way. But I think if Labour is thinking about pitfalls, I would look at countries like Germany to see how very, very quickly slightly technocratic governments become very unpopular and creates a space for slightly, what we now call the hard right populism on the left and the right.
And it's very striking, and you guys have all seen it from the polls and from how people write about it. Starmer is going to win a huge majority. Joe, you've just seen an MRP poll out, and it's a stonker.
There's a brand new one, and it's saying that Labour could win 450 seats, putting the Lib Dems on 71, and actually pushing the Tories into third place with 60 seats, and actually Reform in that are looking at getting like 17 seats, which would be this isn't a political point, but incredible in terms of a piece of political study, from where that party would come from 0 seats to 17.
And that's the end of the Tory party, really,
right.
on that level, with Reform that big. That's probably the end of it. Larissa, what do you think? What occurs to you when you think about this election?
I think for me, D-Day's really stood out for me. Yeah. I was in Portsmouth the day before the commemoration events in Normandy, And there Rishi Sunak came with his wife. He met with all the veterans. He was, everybody really liked him. They thought he was really genuine. He seemed like he really cared. And
so it was going well.
It was going really, really well.
Really.
And then obviously the day after, he decides not to go to the main event, and you have that image of Keir Starmer and President Zelensky of Ukraine, and I think that will be sort of a standout image for me. I mean, it was just a brilliant PR opportunity for Keir, really, to meet with him.
It's just incomprehensible. The thing is, he'd done that national service policy the week before. He was running on a patriotism ticket, more or less.
Yeah.
And we still don't know, is it just him? He made them wrong? Well, we had David Cameron on the show, and I said to him, you must have said, because David Cameron filled in for him, you must have said, what on earth are you doing? And Cameron was being very loyal, he wouldn't have any of it. But do we have a sense of who, because the defence people you speak to must have, and people who are in the defence side of politics must have been tearing their hair out.
Yeah, well, I was a bit confused because I was told that he was going to that a few weeks before we actually had the event. And yeah, people in the MOD were just completely baffled by it. I just think everybody thought it was madness. And I spoke to one former senior officer who was absolutely outraged by it. He shared the sort of same sentiment as the veterans, that it was just completely disrespectful, basically. Yeah. And obviously he's trying to make out that they're sort of the party that you'd vote for if you want to vote for defence and increased defence spending, and yet he misses that crucial event. We're
going to talk about defence actually and foreign affairs. So some people who get in touch with us, get in touch with the radio programme as well, feel that maybe that's not been given. When we talk about foreign affairs, we might talk about D-Day as an obvious gaffe, but there's a land war in Europe, Middle East is on fire. This actually could be a very foreign affairs election, and it's not. And we'll maybe explore in a moment why that is. Kieran, what stands out for you?
Well, it's actually pretty similar to Jerry. I had a conversation with one of our colleagues at the paper, Alex Massey, a couple of weeks ago about the election, and he made a point that just seems to get truer every day, which is no matter how boring the election may seem, no matter how little anything changes day to day, something funny will happen every single day, and it really has done. And in Scotland,
but not to Keir Starmer, not to Labour, interestingly.
Well, I mean that is true. They seem to be able to. Everything is just deflecting off them, and when it's your time, it's your time, yeah. and everything just falls for you. Things that would have tripped up Keir Starmer in an election where everything was going against him, he's able just to hurdle over, or at least only stumble a little bit, and no one really notices because something mad has happened. Like, in Scotland, Douglas Ross resigns as leader of the Scottish Conservatives halfway through the campaign.
That's never happened before, has it?
It's never happened before. It's just after having forced out, or after the Scottish Conservative Party forced out a candidate who wanted to stand because they said he was too sick. Again, it was.
And he said he wasn't.
He said he wasn't. But it's like it is a crystallisation of. Well, but it's only a flesh wound. But it's a crystallisation of everything that people worry about with the Conservatives. That idea that they will say to one of their own candidates, your illness means you're not fit to be an MP, sums up what people would criticise the Conservatives for about how they handle the welfare state. And then to have the leader of the party replace him and then resign, it just seems to sum up the madness of this campaign.
So if this is a kind of look, there's a squirrel campaign election, maybe the starting point of this is an important economic election. And it's important because we've had no growth since before the financial crash. There are all sorts of problems globally, as you've been mentioning. And no one seems to want to be honest with us. Yeah. And it feels like whoever is in power will either have to borrow more, raise taxes, or cut public spending, or possibly a combination of all three. Yeah. We're not hearing that, are we, actually from the parties themselves?
Yeah, it hasn't been so funny on the economics front, I'll be honest. I have to look through a lot of that, the memes and some of the virality of this campaign, because on the things that I concentrate on, I don't think I can ever remember, and I'll be honest, I haven't really been covering general elections that long, I can't remember so much frustration at the state of the parlour state of our economic debate before an election. And so we have figures like Paul Johnson, who had a press conference in Westminster on Monday, and Paul is a lovely, serene bloke, but there was almost smoke blowing out of his nose because he's so frustrated at the fact that there is no levelling with people. No. And if you have a Labour Party that could win a supermajority, they can probably afford to be a little bit honest. I don't think it's going to touch their majority at the sides. Yeah. So why is Labour doing this? I think in some ways there's a perverse narrative that everyone knows that the message is going to have to change. It's created inevitability around the fact that eventually when Rachel Reeves becomes Chancellor, and she's already spoken about her first 10 weeks in office, that there's already a manoeuvring to be like, oh, actually, yeah, maybe it's a bit worse than we thought. And I think the thing that isn't really spoken about is that Labour can do a lot to find money in the short run, and they can do lots of kind of stealth technocratic things that don't really look like tax rises and they don't sound like tax rises, but it does give them fiscal headroom. And I think there are these little pockets and pots of money that they've already got their eye on. They're not income tax rises, they're not VAT rises, they're not national insurance rises.
They've made that very clear.
That's clear. But they're tweaks around inheritance tax, they're capital gains, they're...
Which then, when we ever asking about that, they do not give that clear answer. So you can see...
They're not categorical.
They are basically signalling, aren't they? They're waving a giant flag saying, we are going to do this stuff, but we don't want to tell you about it now.
There's a way to measure the country's debt ratio, which gives them more room by excluding or including debt accumulated by the Bank of England. That it just gives you an automatic, like, on paper windfall. Yeah. People don't really understand any of this stuff. Of course, if they read the Times and our coverage, they will be very well adept at understanding what these issues are. But these are all kind of technocratic fixes. And when I think about Rachel Reeves, I think she definitely has a bias towards technocratic measures. So using institutions, using kind of balance sheet ways to find money, because that's the sort of realm of possibility that they've limited themselves to.
Joe, do you think that there's people are scared of Liz? Are they scared of Liz Truss? I remember Mary Justin from a financial point of view and Jerry from a political point of view, and anyone else has a view on this, but they're scared of what happened to Liz Truss. That it feels to me that the markets would probably be quite sympathetic to borrowing to invest, to at least to a certain extent. They'd probably be quite sympathetic to tax rises done in the right way for the purpose of investment. And yet they don't want to do anything startling. It feels to me that the lesson of Liz Truss, whatever else she may have left Britain, is don't be startling, don't be radical. And that could be a problem because you might need to be radical occasionally, and people are scared of the market.
So the markets aren't scared of Labour, and Liz Truss did absolutely everything wrong. Like, it will be so hard to be that bad all at the same time. Liz Truss was also operating in a punishing financial environment where inflation was 11% and interest rates are going up. Inflation has hit 2%, interest rates are going down. I think Labour, and I speak to bondholders, big creditors who hold huge amounts of UK sovereign debt, they are willing to give Rachel Reeves an extra 20 or 30 billion pound in borrowing as long as she's got a decent plan. It's costed by the OBR, and the OBR effectively can say, yes, this will improve the long-term growth of the economy. I think Liz Truss plays a strange role for the Labour Party. She's obviously an amazing battering ram for them to show how bad the Conservatives have handled the economy. But you shouldn't talk about Liz Truss too much, because actually you're creating quite a perverse precedent for yourself. And the truth is Labour are never going to be as bad as Liz Truss.
So don't say Candyman several times in case they actually appear.
Exactly, it happens. Don't keep saying the word Liz Truss because you might be creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think very quickly they should ditch the Liz Truss rhetoric as soon as they're in office.
Kieran, do you think Rishi should have done more to kill Liz Truss? Because there's an argument, you'll have in this, Jerry, as well, that Keir Starmer metaphorically killed Jeremy Corbyn. Rishi Sunak has never really killed Liz Truss, and he's slightly on the hook for everything she did.
Well, it's a funny kind of duality from Rishi Sunak in that he was so strong and strident, warning against Liz Truss's plans when they were against each other for the Conservative leadership, and then since he came into office, hasn't even stood up and said, look, I was right, and as you say, just politically killed her off, which would have seemed like the obvious thing to do. You know, when in some ways it was more difficult for Rishi Sunak. When he was Chancellor, he resigned over Partygate. When he was running for a leader, he went through Liz Truss's ideology, and then when he became Prime Minister, he didn't even go back on his own record and say, look, I was correct. These things that the public are really angry about, we need to leave them aside. But it speaks to Rishi Sunak's strange political missteps that he keeps making all over. And I was struck by what Miriam was saying in her first answer about Labour learning from the centre-left across the world and how not to lose. Maybe about 18 months ago or so, there was a delegation of UK Scottish Labour went across to a conference, I think it was in Germany, but certainly with various centre-left parties, to learn how to win. And it might be time for them to go back and revisit that for the pitfalls to avoid, because Rishi Sunak has walked and stepped on every landmine in front of him.
And Joe, the knock on Sunak is he's not very good at politics. And you can see him with the betting scandal. He does maybe in the right decision, but 10 days after it would make any positive difference to him. Same with killing Liz Truss. He was on the Sun election debate thing, and he went for Liz Truss then, but we're 4 weeks into an election campaign.
Yeah.
He kind of gets there, but he doesn't get there quick enough. And we live in a very fast world now in terms of news and stories.
Yeah, and this is the criticism actually that you hear from a lot of his MPs a lot of the time. You know, they're not saying it publicly, but if they're having a cup of coffee with me or one of my colleagues in Parliament, they might say, look, the massive problem is he doesn't have political instinct, can't react very quickly to things, in a way that, in a strange, perverse way, Liz Truss maybe did a bit more. Look, it was insane political theory, but she could react to it quickly and kind of knew where those were going. So, and I want to be very clear, that's not me saying that Liz Truss was a better Prime Minister, but like there is a kind of very difference in their leadership style, right? So I think that's right, and I think that he hasn't grasped the kind of, the instincts and the vibes, if you will. I think it's fair to say with Sunak as well, he is kind of haunted by the ghosts of Conservative past, whether it's Liz Truss, whether it's Boris Johnson, and he did take up the reins at a time when there were essentially events and circumstances beyond his control. I think that's really fair to say. I think it's also fair to say he hasn't been very good at fixing those.
Yeah, you can't fight political gravity is one argument. That 14 years is 14 years, and we've had an awful lot of problems in that time. Not all of them of his causing, but, and you've seen it in Scotland as well, if you're there for a long time, eventually you get caught and you have to defend the record, and if the record's long enough, it will have bad stuff in it, and maybe a lot of bad stuff in it.
And that's exactly what's happened in Scotland with the SNP, 17 years in power, even longer than the Conservatives, and they're finding that political gravity is just pulling them down. They've probably got a higher base because of the constitutional question, but it's still a big struggle. Yeah,
and we'll get to that in a minute. Liz, we've mentioned that defence isn't necessarily a high priority in this campaign. Are you surprised by that? Because there is a version of events that, as Miriam was saying, you look across, there's lots going on in the world, lots of elections going on in the world, it's a lot of change happening in the world. In the realm of defence, we have an actual land war in Europe, Putin on the march, there are problems all over the world, Middle East being a case in point. We're constantly told it's an unsafe world. We're told by Grant Shapps it's a pre-war world rather than a sort of previous post-war world. Are you surprised it's not higher on the agenda? Both defence, but I suppose defence as it bleeds into foreign affairs.
I think it's a difficult one because if you ask sort of normal people, they'll probably say that they're more concerned about the NHS and education. But you know, there was that sort of debate early on about the defence spending and that 2.5% target. So obviously the Conservatives came out and said that they would meet that target by 2030. Labour obviously have got, they're offering sort of something slightly different. They're saying that they are going to reach that target, but they haven't set out by when, which is obviously quite a crucial point. And then when you look at other stuff, though, there isn't really a clear dividing line when it comes to things like international politics and what to do about Ukraine. Labour and the Tories have both said that they would obviously support Ukraine. And when I'm speaking to diplomats and my Ukrainian contacts, they aren't worried about Labour getting in. You know, in the previous election, there was lots of security concerns and the Tories could play on that fear of Corbyn coming in. And now they can't really, because Keir isn't offering anything that shocking when it comes to defence. And so they haven't really, there isn't a sort of, you're not going to pick the Tories because you're worried about defence.
Even David Cameron said that, right? In that leaked hoax call that he got caught on the other day, he even said to who he thought was the former Ukrainian Prime Minister, but wasn't because it was a Russian hoax, that, you know, there's, you know, not even a flag paper basically between them and Labour on Ukraine.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
And that's a problem, Joe. It's a very weird election this. You can have a majority potentially of 400 and the two parties could not be going in more opposite directions. And yet when you talk about most of these, is this true of the economy actually, Marion? That actually, even in the economy, they're not, I keep saying when I have Labour people on my show, all you're really saying is we can do a lot of what the Tories did, but we'll do it better. And we've got to believe that you'll do it better. It's amazing that in defence there's nothing different. There's not that much different in the economy, really, do you think? Or do you think there is?
No, I mean, just on the defence issue, I think the big counterpoint is probably the US, where foreign policy has become a huge liability for Biden. And then I wonder, used to be based out in Brussels, that once, if indeed we have a Trump presidency, the whole idea of Western security becomes supercharged, and this is about NATO, and then perhaps maybe the imperatives about what it means to have a Western alliance become interesting. So I think maybe we're shunting some of the defence worries into later into the year. On the economy, because Labour have chosen to do one really big thing, which is to keep the Tories' fiscal rules, they've decided that they're going to wear exactly the same straitjacket as them on fiscal policy and on borrowing. Yeah. That is a massive constraint, and it's a huge continuity with the previous regime. Labour think that they have to do that because they think fiscal rules are incredibly important. I always think it's a huge irony that we left the European Union, perhaps the only jurisdiction in the world which fetishises fiscal rules, to only then develop an entirely new fetish of our own, which are exactly the same fiscal rules that the European Union imposes. So 3% deficit, 3% deficit, yeah. So, talking about, alignment as such, we've already kind of like taken on this very, I think, this obsession with why fiscal rules are important.
Take back control and do the same thing.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is.
This question of Trump, Lewis. Trump was kind of right, wasn't he? I mean, it's an interesting Trump figure, very destabilising figure, mad in lots of respects, and one of the things when he was in power, he said lots of things, didn't always do them. You can never really work out that relationship between what he says and what he'll do. But his point about NATO, most people, when they really boil it down, would say he was right. A lot of European countries with an aggressor on their border, not the US's border, have basically been saying, please you spend all your money, we don't want to. Yeah. He wasn't wrong about that, was it? And that's become kind of political orthodoxy in the last 6 months.
Yeah, I think if, you speak to diplomats and they think it's been quite positive, because the fact is that he's called on countries to increase their defence spending. He's threatened them, with potentially the US, removing itself from NATO if they don't spend more, and it has actually had a result, and a positive result. And actually, the Tories have said that if they do get in, then they will be going to the NATO summit the week after the election and calling for all the other countries to increase their defence spending to 2.5%. Of course, there is a suggestion that Trump will then argue that it should actually be 3%. But he's sort of, he's created this whole sort of desire for that spending to go up, and the US can't, people can't keep freeloading off the US is sort of his view, and I think actually a lot of people do agree with him. Europe should be increasing their defence. Why should America spend, nearly 4% of their national income on defence when other countries are spending less than 2%?
Yeah. It's very hard to counter that argument, strikes me. Jerry, what do you make of reform in all of this? Because Farage came out and he said, I'm not saying Putin's a good person. There was a brilliant moment, it was in the paper today, where in Salisbury, you see that reform candidate in Salisbury said, I've met Putin and he's a pretty good bloke.
And he's all right.
Yeah.
I love Salisbury.
You're in Salisbury. What are you possibly thinking of?
What a guy.
But there is this issue, and this is true of Trumpists in America, that in the old days, if you were a right-wing patriot, you hated Russia. And actually your hatred of Russia was a keynote to your political philosophy. What's striking now in the populist right is actually the strongman Russia is a little bit attractive. Yeah. It's a little bit, Ukraine, which is certainly true, has its political corruption problems. It's easy to over fetishize how great Ukraine is. That's a kind of intellectually substantial point. But there's this lust for the autocrat in the populist right. Does that ultimately damage reform? Because there is also a line of people who might want to vote for reform, or of traditional conservatives who are big on defence, who like Ben Wallace, like that sort of very traditional Tory approach to defence. Is that will that hurt Farage, do you think, in the end?
Potentially, and I was actually quite surprised that he stuck to his guns quite heavily on it, actually. I thought, not that Farage is the kind of politician that will pull his punches or necessarily go back from what he said in the past, but I was quite surprised at him putting videos out saying, no, this is why I think, this is why I stand by this. I found that quite interesting. And Reform's whole philosophy is that they have candidates, including Nigel Farage himself, who have their own minds, right? That they're not constrained by, say, like a party whip, that they'll only get rid of their candidates if it's something they deem very, very serious. And we've seen that with the streams upon streams of stories about problematic comments their candidates have made and things like that, and they've stood by them. But yeah, no, I think you're completely right. It could cost them votes, but the story of reform in this election and after it, I think, is going to be one of the most kind of fascinating narratives. Yeah. Not only for how many seats they gain, but actually what happens afterwards. What does that do to our parliament? If Nigel Farage wins in Clacton, which some polls say he will, seeing him in Parliament is going to be quite a moment. What does it do to the future of the Conservative Party? How do Labour react, actually, if they're in government? There are so many aspects to reform entering frontline politics, which could really change the whole landscape.
And they don't have to be serious either, I don't. That's the other thing that strikes me. They don't have to cost anything properly.
No, and their manifesto is, they will say it's fully costed, but there are some, there we go, right. So there are some
I'm
pretty...
not to be Paul Johnson about this, but
Yeah, exactly,
You get angry about that. Yeah.
Also, Farage has said that, I mean, going back to the sort of defence side of it, he said that they will spend 3% of GDP on defence, and he's also said that they'll boost troop numbers by as many as 30,000. So he's sort of appealing to that side of the people.
But he's anti-NATO. Isn't it weird? Because NATO
Parroting Trump, though.
Yeah, the
thinks it
expansionist
works.
NATO.
Yeah.
And that's where the Trump-Putin semi-loving, I suppose, from Nigel Farage comes into this. As you said, both strong men, and it positions him in a kind of interesting political space after the election. If Labour is technocratic, underwhelming, there is still space for a populist pushback. If people don't feel that their lives are getting better a couple of years into a Labour government, someone like Nigel Farage, being the strong man with populist policies, he must be looking across Europe just now and thinking there's space for me.
I think it also shows that, so thinking about his peers, so Farage takes his political cues from like the isolationist wing of the Republican Party. That's kind of his lodestar for politics. If he looked in Europe and he wanted to understand how to be a successful populist, he should look at Giorgia Meloni, because the first thing she did in office was to reaffirm her complete support for Ukraine, and that has basically brought her into the entire political mainstream. It's made her one of the most important politicians in Europe, maybe even in the Western world. Everyone wants a bit of her, and she did that by making a clear line on Ukraine. Le Pen is being forced to do that. In Germany, the AfD might be forced to do that. But Trump is still looking to the Republicans for his political cues on Ukraine. And I think if he looked a little bit towards Europe, he could have actually managed this delicate exercise of bringing himself into.
So this could be a misstep then, in your view. This could actually, he could have actually. He's always seen to be this great zeitgeist man, the most influential politician of our era. But he actually could have slightly missed the zeitgeist on that.
Yeah, and I think Meloni's an example of how she did it incredibly well, and everyone's following her. And it's working for them domestically, and he's made such a faux pas that I think, I've noticed that even the Daily Mail has become much more scathing about him in the last week, for example.
And he's very hurt about that. You can see the crocodile tears are falling everywhere. Tiny violin playing. Let's talk about Scotland, Kieran, because it will lead us into, I think, another area that perhaps has been undercovered. Some would say, I suppose, which is net zero environmental policies. What's going to happen with North Sea oil and the like of it. The political orthodoxy is that Scotland provides the keys to Labour to Downing Street, but that's in a close election or a semi-close election. So in a different world, we'd be poring over Anna Sarwar, the performance of Labour in Scotland, and a seat here, a seat there would make a huge difference. Has that just simply not happened because Labour are carrying all before them, at least in the polls everywhere else?
Well, the UK-wide poll suggests that Keir Starmer doesn't need Scotland to win a majority to win the election. Now, of course, there's a kind of two-pronged argument that Labour make against that. One is that the polls may be wrong and every MP counts, blah blah blah. Secondly, that Keir Starmer says he wants to feel that he can be a legitimate Prime Minister for the whole UK, which means winning more than the 2 seats they currently hold out of Scotland's 59, soon to be 57 constituencies. But the other thing that is probably more important for anyone who cares about the future of the United Kingdom is what this election means in terms of momentum for both Labour and the SNP for the Holyrood election in 2 years' time. The SNP currently in government, currently only 2 seats short of a majority in the Scottish Parliament, but wobbling. And Labour thinks that if it can win the most seats at the general election, keep that momentum going, find some way of being the largest party, or at least making it impossible for the SNP to form a government in 2026, that puts Anna Sarwar into power and gives Labour a greater grip across the UK generally, but also effectively takes independence off the table for at least 10 years.
Didn't Labour also, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you'll know far more than me, but use a lot of kind of Scotland as a testing ground, basically, for this Westminster election. So if you take the Rutherglen by-election, for example, their slogan there was like "Make Work Pay," right? And Labour's workers' rights deal has now been rebranded as "Make Work Pay," like rather than a new deal for working people, which just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? But you know, it feels like that they were really buoyed by that by-election and actually have imported a lot of the campaigning strategies that was in that into the rest of the UK.
Yeah, Rutherglen was a really good opportunity for Labour to kind of test that. Former heartland. It's almost, in a way, it's almost like a red wall seat, but however many 100 miles north. In that former Labour heartland, won by the SNP, it flipped about between 15, 17, 2019 elections, and they just ran a campaign that paid off with an incredible victory. And absolutely, they looked at that, looked at the messaging that worked on the doors, realised that despite the narrative from some places, Scottish working class, middle class, aspirational voters are not that different from the same type of voters across the UK, and imported a lot of the messages down.
So on that point, because I think it's interesting, because Scotland is peculiarly sited geographically, because it's close to the North Sea, so this issue of net zero, transitioning off fossil fuels is more pressing in Scotland than it is the rest of the UK, it's probably fair to say. But, I'm interested in the economics of this as well, Marina, in a moment, but is this an election where the net zero dog is not barking, people don't care about it, are they sceptical of it? Is it a vote, is it classic Labour, don't screw this up, don't say too much, don't overpromise because you're not doing that anywhere? Where's in Scotland's probably a good example of this. What's the prevailing consensus?
In Scotland, it's quite mixed up in that Labour are getting attacked from both the Conservatives and the SNP over their plans to ban any new licences for the North Sea. They say it's thousands of jobs. Aberdeen, which has been the UK's hub for the oil and gas industry, but it's already struggling a bit as the industry not quite winds down, but slows down certainly. Warnings about all the jobs at risk there, but slightly bizarrely, I know that private focus groups that Labour have done, private polling shows that their policies are popular in every part of Scotland, including in the northeast of Scotland, because there are people, including people who work offshore, that think that that basically they want secure jobs for the future, and they think that their companies, the people that employ them, probably can afford to pay a little bit more at some points. But in Scotland, this debate is of course skewered slightly as well, because the SNP just ended a very tumultuous coalition with the Scottish Greens, which just put a whole new dynamic on how anyone sees the kind of green agenda, I suppose, in Scotland.
Loads of you getting in touch with your questions. Do keep them coming in. If you're on YouTube, just leave a comment. There's a little button if you're following the live stream. Mary Neal's asked this question, which I think is a broader one as well. He says, all energy experts would agree that decarbonising our electricity generation by 2030 is nearly impossible. Why does Labour pretend that it is possible? Which speaks to a broader scepticism that, again, are we being told the truth on this? And actually, we can't afford to go full out for net zero. Biden kind of tried it. Biden said he was going to invest.
He's trying it big time.
Yeah. And why is that? Has that worked? Is there a lesson from America there for us in this?
So, has it worked is a good question. Is he going to get re-elected is Biden going to get re-elected on his massive economic stimulus program? Probably like the biggest change in economic orthodoxy in the world's largest economy, right? They're basically going for industrial policy, something Americans have been allergic to since the 19th century. He's not going to get re-elected on that basis. The economy is a huge weak point for Biden. That's an entirely different debate. So when I ask Labour, who really look at Bidenomics as like their lodestar, like about how a progressive government can create good jobs, win back the losers of globalization, also hold back the tide of populism, also compete with China in areas where China has become dominant. So it's a foreign policy strategy, it's an economic strategy, and it's a political strategy. So we're putting a lot of responsibility on this policy to work. Biden's not going to get re-elected on it, so the question I always ask Labour is that this might be a good strategy, morally it might be a good thing to do, but you can't necessarily get re-elected on it. And they think, well, no, actually, maybe we can. It's different for us. So,
but they have rowed back, haven't they? Which suggests they don't.
Yes. So I think over the last 6 to 8 months, what they've done is massively deprioritise their climate activism and really put a new priority on their fiscal discipline. And for Labour, those two things are actually in tension. So the ULEZ debate in London, some of the other ways about the cost of the just transition. and how it's going to hurt working people, which is partially pushed by people like Nigel Farage, has really forced Labour to move into a more fiscally orthodox direction, but they're still keeping all of their climate rhetoric. The truth is that the target to decarbonise the electricity grid by 2030 is a nice ambition. It's not a binding target. The only binding targets the UK has is their 2050 net zero target and some of the sort of steps along the way which they're being judged on by the Paris Agreement and by the Committee on Climate Change, who tell the government what they need to do.
And they say they're not getting there. They're saying they're not going to deliver.
And we're not getting there at all. So we won't decarbonise the energy grid by 2030. GB Energy is this renewable energy company that Labour are going to set up. Even people who are really for it think that it's going to be a minor bit part player in the way that
it's another lie. I mean, it's another lie, maybe too strong. It's another fiction that we live in this world where everything, fiscal rules depend on what happens in 5 years' time.
Yeah.
Hitting net zero depends on 2050.
Yeah.
And so we're always just about saying, well, yeah, we hope this will happen, but we probably won't be around in 2050 to answer this question.
So Labour's bet is actually the private sector is going to do this all for them.
Yeah.
The private sector is going to invest in the economy to make the economy go, and the private sector is going to do the green transition, and that's how we're going to get to the green transition. So Labour, in this sense, are technologists. They're relying on the innovation to get us there, and to be honest, the innovation is getting us quite far. But if I really have to step back and think about the climate change debate, what the UK does and what Europe does doesn't really matter.
No, it's China, India.
It's China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, the big global emitters, and Britain will have to play a very clever diplomatic role in helping entice these governments to get on board with net zero, and that means giving them money.
And the other thing on that technological point is jobs. So every political party has made promises about manufacturing jobs, about attracting, the jobs for the future, and they've all failed. I remember in 2011, the SNP's big pitch was 1,000 jobs in Dundee, the city that I live in, manufacturing wind turbines. Not a single one. Yeah. And so Labour, a big thing that Labour's going to have to do is, even if it's not them providing the jobs through the government, it's going to have to attract something that makes people feel better.
The weakest part of this industrial strategy, which Biden is also finding, is that they're just not as many jobs as promised. No. We're not going to reindustrialise Europe. We might stop the deindustrialisation of Europe, but at best that's a plateau, and it's
There's a kind of a hit and hope about it, isn't there? That we hope this will happen, but hope is not necessarily the right thing in politics. You mentioned diplomacy there. We want to talk a bit about Brexit. Lots of people asking questions about Brexit. One of the things that sort of maybe a starting point for this, Larissa, is who is more impressive on the global stage? People are asking that question. If you compare Labour versus the Conservatives, I suppose it boils down to Cameron and Sunak and Starmer and Lamy. Do you have a sense of that? Or actually, are they pretty close and therefore it doesn't actually matter?
Well, actually, before the election was called, a minister told me that they felt that Rishi didn't care about defence, but also didn't really care about sort of international affairs.
Yeah.
You didn't really see, you saw sort of Lord Cameron out an awful lot. He was doing all the big trips and
he was loving it.
And loving it, and Rishi left him to it. That said, I just don't think there's a huge difference between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak from the perspective of European nations and America. I just think there isn't a sort of clear division between the two. I think that Keir Starmer's extremely well respected. A diplomat in Eastern Europe told me just a few days ago that they like him. They're not concerned about Keir Starmer.
He's basically boring everyone into kind of a submission, isn't it? I mean, being serious, that's the tactic, like bore your way to victory. And he could bore his way to 400 strong majority. It's an extraordinary paradox, really, of this election.
Yeah, there's nothing controversial.
No.
So,
I think there's a personnel dividend that will definitely come in the Brussels chat. So yeah, definitely. So the EU's had a leadership change now. So the top diplomat from in the EU is probably going to be an Estonian woman called Kaja Kallas. The Estonians generally have always been very partial to the UK because of the UK's support for Ukraine. I think that's helpful to have the leader of the EAS from an Eastern European country. I think the fact that the personnel changes, the fact that whatever the Brexit debate is going to look like, the fact that you've just got two sets of different people sitting around the table after many years of the same Tories doing that trade and cooperation agreement and that awful Brexit deal which took so long, I think that just the optics of it is going to be better. There's going to be less pressure on the people around the room. They won't really know each other. There's a bit more goodwill around, less bad faith, because some of those negotiations were really tarred by a lot of bad faith. So I think they're like small pockets of wins that will just happen because there's new faces around.
What I will say about Lamy, though, is it's fascinating his connections. I mean, we were speaking about D-Day earlier. I think the general understanding is that Starmer wasn't supposed to be at some of those events, and actually it was was Lammy's diplomacy and international connections that actually got them in the room. He's very close with Obama, for example, and I think and Macron as well. And I think that kind of backroom working that he's been doing is going to be extremely helpful for Labour in government.
But throw into that though, Macron, lame duck president, and a Le Pen-inspired French Parliament. We're not talking about stopping the boats. I imagine that conversation's been had a million times. But one major part of Labour's strategy to stop the boats is to get in with the French. And Lamy might be good with Macron, but he's not going to be very good with the National Rally, you wouldn't have thought.
No, that's right. And I think, you know, let's not get hung up on the stop the boats thing because we could talk about it for hours. But I think the big part of Labour's pitch here is basically not that different from the Tories. Like, sure, they're not going to do Rwanda, but it's not that different in terms of actual concrete measures. Like, Keir Starmer can sit there and say we want to smash the gangs. Does he really think that the Conservatives haven't been trying to smash the gangs, right?
I've been hearing that for years and years.
Exactly. So it's not like the Conservatives haven't been trying. It's not quite that simple. You do need international cooperation. You're right, changing in leadership abroad might make that more difficult.
Are they scared, Kieran? Are they scared of Brexit? Is Brexit... Labour don't want to talk about it. The Lib Dems, I remember 2019, it was the title of their manifesto was No to Brexit.
That went really well for them.
It did go well for them. Are we kind of, in a very British way, slightly awkward about Brexit? We did something really bold, and now, whether we liked it or not, we're a bit embarrassed of having done something as bold as that. We don't. Some people think it's gone all right. Very few people would say it's gone well, and the people who think it hasn't gone well might think it's because people haven't done it properly. So there's still an ideological divide there, very clearly. But it's not a Brexit election, this. Nicholas asks, why are Labour scared to discuss Brexit? David asks, which leader, when, will eventually say, we've got economic problems, there is some money to be had by being closer to Europe. Who's going to make the case for that?
Well, so to the latter question, the answer is the SNP and John Swinney. They set out their manifesto about rejoining the EU, set out how much money they said that would benefit the UK in terms of trade deal. The IFS largely stood that up and backed up before pointing out, of course, that independence would then disrupt and have, similar trade effects. So I suppose the answer is the SNP. They are majoring on Brexit to a degree in the election in Scotland. They're pushing that as an issue, but it's not particularly cutting through, and that kind of loops around to that first question and brings in your Lib Dem point, which is one of the reasons Keir Starmer isn't talking about this is because it's not a vote winner. People are pretty scarred from the Brexit years, whether you were in favour of it, whether you were against it. And one of the reasons that Get Brexit Done worked so well for Boris Johnson in 2019 was because people were just like, just stop speaking about it. And so to bring it up now as a major issue risks having any sort of controversy, which, as we've covered, Keir Starmer really doesn't want.
But there is one major constituency in the UK, which is the business community, and they really want us to get close as possible. But there is a squeamishness and a reticence about business lobbies speaking up and saying that they would like closer alignment because they think that makes them kind of a political lightning rod.
Or anti-democratic.
And anti-democratic. But like, if maybe on just a long view, and like my hot take about the UK rejoining, I think weirdly enough, all of this populism in Europe might be good for a potential rejoining of the UK, because one of the issues that I have with the idea of us joining the EU is that we don't know what the EU is going to look like when we want to rejoin. And now we can probably say, with the kind of hampered France and Germany, the EU's integration effects are going to be basically in the sand for a couple of years, maybe even a decade. So if the UK does want to rejoin, the EU might look a little bit like the one that we left, which is one that we can rejoin. If it's going full steam integration, I don't think the UK can fit into that European Union. So I think, weirdly enough, not that anyone in the UK, particularly Labour, would admit it, but like paralysis, far right, on fire, France and Germany is not so bad for the kind of project that we would want to be back into.
Is it straightforward to say, is there money on the table? Because there's this figure that's often used, 4% of GDP if you rejoin the EU.
That's the OBR's figure on...
Is that credible, do you think?
Yeah, so we have to be really careful because a lot of people have been getting this wrong recently. So it's not 4% per year on the growth figure, it's the level of GDP. So it's not like, so we're growing about 0.5% this year. If we were in the EU, it would not be 4.5%. No. Right, so we have to differentiate.
In fact, no EU countries are doing that. They're not growing that.
No, nobody's growing that far. I mean, Spain are getting to about 2 or 3%, but that's remarkable even in the European sense. So So what are the big benefits of the single market? Very close alignment. The UK probably should not be signing trade deals with any other countries because it increases the divergence. We're having a carbon border adjustment mechanism, the same as the EU. We're meeting defence spending targets. Like the EU, we have net zero targets, some of which are more ambitious than the EU. So actually, a lot of the Brexit divergence hasn't happened, which is good for Labour because it means they don't have to, pull us a little bit further to get closer to the EU. So I think, in some senses, it's not a bad inheritance for Keir to have, right?
Yeah.
The one that he might get right now.
Lewis, if with a 400-seat majority, there is an argument that he could start doing all sorts of things that seem politically very difficult. But do you get the sense that Brexit is just one of those things that it's just not worth him touching? Which is kind of people object to it. I know people that get in touch with our programme all the time and say, why are we not at least honest about it? Why? Because I had David Cameron on, we said to him, do you think Brexit has gone well? And he just wouldn't answer. And he clearly doesn't, but he wouldn't answer it. And if I said that to Keir Starmer, he would basically say, I think we could have done more, we'd do it better, but he wouldn't disagree with the principles. Is there no majority so big that would actually make it worth his while, do you think, Ruth?
I think it's just a toxic issue for them, isn't it? I don't think it's going to, whatever they say, they're not going to pull in voters. I mean, they do actually say in their manifesto that they will increase sort of defence cooperation in some way, defence and security cooperation with the EU. And actually that was interestingly what the Tories picked up on straight away, because they were sort of trying to give the impression that Labour were going to sort of drag us back into the idea of like an EU army, which everyone said they were terrified of a few years ago.
That was one of the three things.
That's a flashback.
Yeah. It was Turkey joining the EU, an EU army, and 350 million for the NHS. They were the three things that won Brexit.
Yeah, and I asked Labour exactly what they meant by that, and I didn't get any detail. So who knows? But they're planning to do something that would lead to greater integration.
Procurement kind of stuff.
Possibly, yeah.
Make it as boring as possible.
Yeah. As soon as I said procurement, I was bored as well.
Important though, but boring.
Yeah.
Some questions that have come in for you. We've got about 10 minutes left, so if you do keep them coming in, they're all really interesting. It's a bit looking ahead, but before we get to looking ahead, let's talk about how this campaign has gone. Is this the apathy election? Is there a danger of this becoming an apathy election? Jerry, what happens with poor turnout? Because change elections historically tend to get higher turnout because it's a moment. 2001, everyone knew what was going to happen. Nobody really voted. But we've said Starmer not popular, about as popular as Corbyn was. Labour and Tory, if you take their vote share together, it's as low as it's ever been, more or less, in history. There are these other parties rising up, like Reform, the Greens, Lib Dems, potentially, as you were saying earlier, could be doing better than expected. If this is a shrugged shoulder of an election, what does that mean? Does it affect... He'll have a huge mandate, but not a huge popular mandate. Does that matter?
So I think turnout will be low, and I think that is because people have had too much politics, right? So I always put it like, my auntie, who doesn't really care about politics, should not know who junior ministers are by name, right? Like, that's unhealthy. It's fine for me and us and, our very informed readers to know that, but like, my aunt that doesn't give two figs about politics shouldn't really know who Chris Philp is, for example. So I
Mel
think
Stride. Everyone knows Mel Stride. No,
well, I mean, he's out every day.
He's probably out there now.
But so I think people have had too much politics, and I just think there's so much apathy out there. I spend a lot of my time going out on constituency visits, knocking on doors with politicians, and a lot of the answers you get is just, you're either all as bad as each other, we're done with you, and actually trust is so low that people just don't believe that anyone can deliver change. And it's like, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where no one's being entirely truthful, and voters aren't stupid, right? They know that.
I went out on the doors with Johnny Mercer, the Veterans Minister, and
that was an interesting.
It was brilliant. It was brilliant because actually I'd put in a few bids with CCHQ, and I've not been allowed to go out with Grant Shapps, for example, or Penny Mordaunt, but Johnny just sort of messaged back and say, come on down, ignored all the CCHQ protocol. So I went out with him, and interestingly, on the doors, no one was saying like, I love Keir, I'm going to vote for Labour. Just nobody really knew what they were going to do.
But did they know they weren't going to vote Tory?
So I went with Johnny, and then I went with his Labour rival for the afternoon, Fred Thomas. Some of the people with Fred who ran up the doors with Fred said that they were going to vote Labour. With Johnny, there was one Labour supporter, and then Tories, and then the rest didn't have a clue. One actually said that they might vote reform because they haven't been swayed by Labour. They know they don't want to vote for the Tories, but Labour didn't really offer them anything.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, isn't it? That this is so much of an anti-Conservative election.
Yeah.
That it's not a Labour surge. It's even, we talked about the vote shares for each party. Remember 2017, that election that was supposed to be such a disaster for Theresa May, and it was in terms of the electoral maths. But the vote share for both Labour and the Conservatives was proportionally really high. Yeah. But this is not, their Labour not inspiring people. Folk just are tired of the Conservatives, want them out, so will vote for whoever will best do that. It was a focus group that Times Radio did of former SNP voters in Scotland who were scathing about Keir Starmer, spent 5 minutes lambasting him as being underwhelming, and then got asked, okay, you've got to decide who you're going to vote for, and all bar one said we're going to vote Labour because we're tired of the SNP. You know, it's a pretty bad-tempered election.
What are the issues that, says Johnny Mercer, the two things that people care most about on that door knock?
I think it's NHS and the economy, basically, like what happens with the mortgage rates. And
NHS, and we're not talking about NHS, I mean, there's only so many subjects we can cover here, Miriam, but the NHS, again, this is the thing the IFS are wound up about, that everyone talks about their plans for the NHS. They haven't funded them, they've funded bits of them. No one, I mean, social care, no one really talks very much about social care. Social care blocks one end of the NHS. If you don't fix social care, you can't really fix the middle part of the NHS. Actually, most people think we should go towards the preventative end, that upstream they call it. So if you make people less sick, they need the NHS less, you need a smaller NHS to a certain extent. We haven't got I mean, people care about the NHS, but does anyone really have either the ideas or the money to do something significant, do you think?
So in some ways the NHS is in a quite privileged position because we know that, and Rachel has said this before, and we spoke to her at the Times CEO Summit last week, that there's going to be an immediate injection into some emergency public services. The NHS is definitely going to be one of them. I think the NHS is another one of those areas where there's more fiscal room than perhaps Labour would suggest. That's because, again, if you speak to people whose job it is to lend the UK money, they say, okay, if you're going to fix the NHS, that means you're going to fix all of this inactive worker problem. So these long lists of waiting lists for NHS care, which means that millions of people are not in work. That is a supply-side benefit to the economy to get those people back working. So you can actually justify what is usually considered to be wasteful public spending in terms of the productive capacity of the economy. I think if Labour do these narratives well, they make the connections between the NHS and other parts of the economy, the centrality of the NHS to our workforce. We haven't spoken about immigration. I think Labour will continue with this kind of stealth liberal immigration regime to fix worker shortages in key sectors. I think so, because the Tories have effectively done that and then just focused on the boats issue. I think it'd be very sensible for Labour to keep that kind of.
So keep it in the hundreds of thousands, not the tens of thousands, which is the whole.
Focus on the boats, and then just not really, put too much political attention on the migration regime, which is about getting skilled people to fill worker shortages, particularly in the care sector. These are again the sort of, I think, some of the subterfuge and a bit of the doublespeak that Labour will engage with. It's hugely frustrating, I think, for lots of people, but I think for them politically it's just sensible.
A couple of other questions for you. Jerry, answer this one. Lynn says, betting scandals in the Tory party, do they indicate a complete lack of respect for the election? How much do they matter, in your view?
I think they do matter because I think they add to a general feeling of sleaziness. It's the same argument that we had with Partygate, which is that it's one rule for them and one rule for the rest of us. And I think that just doesn't help when it's essentially already a sinking ship, right? Like, it just adds to that narrative. So I think that's what we're seeing. And without getting into the weeds of it, there is a difference between these various different things of betting that we're hearing about now, and like who placed the bets and when and on what did they place it and things like that. And like, full disclosure, I have a bet of a friend on the election and I lost it. It was £20 on October. So it really depends on what your opinion already is, I think, a lot of the time. If you already think that the Conservatives are busted flush, there's more evidence for you. If you're still sticking with the party now, through all the scandals of the last few years, it's probably not going to change your vote.
Well done. I mean, really.
Oh, quite. Longevity.
Yeah. We do speak to people who get in touch with our programme, and they do say, we don't want to, but we're going to. And you get the reluctant Tory, and that could be bigger than we can see in the polls. There may be a bit of that. Bruce asked this question, which you'll have an answer to, Kieran. Labour bring down voting age to 16. Do you think they will? They said they will. They've done it in Scotland. Does that help Labour? I mean, does that help cement Labour.
In Scotland, it hasn't changed the dynamic all that much.
Really?
It's the SNP brought it in, and I suppose it's slightly skewed because we've been through a period of the SNP brought it in whilst the SNP were dominant. But when you look at the difference between voting intentions for the UK general election and the Holyrood election, they're not massively different. You know, the SNP is kind of going like this, Labour is going like that, and the idea that it's because there's a relatively small number in terms of the over proportion of the electorate who are 16 and 17 year olds, the idea that they are all flocking to the party that gave them the vote, I think is a bit simplistic. It certainly hasn't really been borne out in Scotland.
It's not a revolution.
It's not a revolution.
Is it mitigated by the voter ID thing? Because a lot of younger members of my family, my cousins, don't have their provisional. If they were 16, they wouldn't have their provisional driving license, and then wouldn't necessarily have a passport or something to bring with them. So when I actually think that plays in, especially in the area that I live in, a lot of younger people are just not going to be able to find the.
Presumably they'll get rid of the voter ID stuff where they Labour, will they not?
They've said they won't.
They said they won't.
They haven't said they would get rid of it,
Yeah.
so
That's weird, isn't it? 'Cause they object to it, but why wouldn't they get rid of it?
it's like a lot of things.
It's becoming a bit of a theme. Margaret says, why are journalists not pushing the Brexit questions and forcing answers? I'll answer that one. We do. We just don't get the answers. It's very dispiriting when you have a conversation with someone and you ask the same question 4 times and you don't get an answer. And you can do a Paxman and ask the same question 11 times, but once you've had it 3 or 4 times, you really have to pick other things. I do think journalists do ask the question. Let's look ahead. This is completely invidious of me, and we've not prepared this at all, but I'm going to do it because she can't really run away. So,
that's what you think.
yeah. No money down, no improper betting. We're a week away. A couple of questions, actually. But first of all, do you want to do Labour, size of Labour majority? Maybe is the number of Tory seats more interesting?
More stark.
What do you think? What do you think will happen in the election?
I mean, it's good.
Because the polling, just to be clear, the MRP polling goes from 56 for Tories to 150.
Yeah.
And 150 is basically a little bit worse than 97. So 97, one of the most catastrophic defeats in the Conservative Party history, is on the upper end at the minute of what the polls are saying is possible. So if you go for Tory seats, it's 150 to 50 is kind of the range that's in the polling at the minute.
Yeah. Look, with the caveat that my head is in Scottish polling, where absolutely, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask you,
but where I think the Conservatives are going to probably lose, they've got 6 seats in Scotland just now. I think they'll probably go down to 4-ish. Across the UK, I don't know, 120-ish.
Yeah, which is terribly bad, but maybe survivable.
Yeah.
How SNP the polls go from 5 to 30.
Yeah.
Where are you in the 5 to 30 SNP range?
The polls have been pretty steady in Scotland over the last while, about 18-ish, and I think that feels about right with Labour kind of mid to late 20s in Scotland.
Which is a big deal for Labour.
Massive deal for Labour.
Yeah. Jerry? No
I'm
money down.
going to go on 100 seats for the Tories, which begs the question, where are all the Labour MPs going to sit?
Yeah.
That's my big question.
Tell me about what does that put Labour on that?
Oh, my lord. Well, that depends on reform and the Lib Dems and
Yeah.
stuff like that, right? But if we're taking that poll earlier, for example, say they had 450 MPs, there's just not enough space on one side of the Commons for them. So God knows what will happen there. But let's go with 100 seats for the Tories on the night.
So, which is a disaster,
Yep.
possibly survivable.
Yep.
Probably the worst than 1906, possibly that, isn't it? So it's kind of the worst for more than 100 years. Maureen?
Again, caveat, not my job to really care about polls. I'd go for 80 to 100 range. And the questions I have, probably for Jerry and everyone else, is that there must be Labour candidates who were put up because they thought they were never going to win, who are now in the party. So does that make them more ungovernable from Keir Starmer's perspective, that he's got a lot of these kind of loose or rogue candidates that are suddenly in seats, overturning massive majorities? You know, he has a clear centralising instinct and a clear controlling instinct. It's going to be quite difficult for him to, herd these cats.
That's exactly right. And there's a great story from 97 where someone was put up by Labour to stand on the promise they wouldn't win. And they called Labour office the next day and went, how am I going to tell my wife I'm now an MP? Because they had no chance. And then and it happened in Scotland with the SNP, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And when they have these happened to a certain extent, the Red Wall with the Tories in 2019, you end up with people you never expect to be there. Larissa, not your job. I know you don't look happy with the question.
I'm going to be different. I'm going to say 60.
So you're going to go on the other side. Yeah, it's all possible. Yeah, everything is possible still. This is an interesting election. Although Labour are probably going to win and it's a foregone conclusion and all of that, actually, there's still an awful lot to play for. And the consequence of this in terms of the country, in terms of the politics of the country, it's absolutely huge. We're running out of time. We've run out of time. We could have had this conversation for a lot longer. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you for watching. Thank you to Kieran Andrews, Larissa Brown, Marion Kahn and Jerry Scott. And I just need to remind you of something that's going to happen again. We're going to do this again in a week's time as we get closer to the election. It's just a week away, but on July the 2nd, if you're a Times Plus member, you can register for online streaming of Westminster Your World Live. This again on July the 2nd. You just go to the Times Plus website, mytimesplus.co.uk/events. There's a special How to Win an Election podcast from Times Radio on July the 5th at 11 o'clock. We'll know exactly what has happened by then. Until then, we can just feverishly speculate, which is exactly what we're going to do. It's been a great hour. Thank you for joining us. Good night.